Welcome to The Joe Cohen Show. Join me as I share my experience with biohacking and invite top health experts to explore the latest technology, supplements, research, and resources for optimizing your body and brain. 100%. So let's continue going through some of these markers quickly. So we got the fungal markers, and what you're saying is that most people will have fungal markers. You don't think it's that relevant for everybody, even if it's elevated, but you look at them and to you, it's clear that if somebody's got a lot of elevated fungal markers like tartaric and arabinose, then that means that they've got some fungal infections. And then the question, is it a cause or effect of what's going on? Do you see elevated HSCRP if people have fungal infections or not necessarily?
You mean, yes, the CRP on blood serum test, yeah? I personally don't see a lot of elevated CRP with Candida overgrowth. And I guess CRP, it's more of an acute inflammatory marker. So it tends to only be raised, my understanding is at the beginning of acute inflammation. And then it becomes more the ESR marker, which is more the chronic inflammatory marker that then can be elevated with a normal CRP. So I don't personally see a lot of high CRPs with Candida overgrowth. There probably would be reasons for that, which I probably have to look into, but I don't typically see high CRP with Candida overgrowth. I probably see more higher monocytes. So monocytes, as part of the white cell count, tends to be more indicative of there's something going in the gut. There's some kind of like a gut dysbiosis or something like that going on. So I look a lot at white cell.
Absolute monocyte percentage.
So I actually look at the absolutes and they can still be within the range. Now, I think we use maybe different measuring numbers in the US to Australia. So I'm not necessarily sure how that will translate, but monocytes can still be in the normal range. But if it's if it's in that high normal range, that would be an indication of gut dysbiosis. Here in Australia, I think if it's over 0.6, whatever the measurement is, we start thinking gut dysbiosis, but that would still be in the normal range. It wouldn't be flat on a lab base.
I would say for me personally, my monocytes, let's see, I'm looking at my whole history of monocytes here. They've usually been pretty low, even if I had gut inflammation.
Yeah. So that's why that's why I guess I said in the beginning, I wouldn't necessarily chase numbers on a piece of paper, so to speak. I agree with you. I see a lot of gut dysbiosis and monocytes are normal. So you have to not get, I often use the term miss the forest for the trees kind of thing. So whilst test markers and all of this biochemistry stuff is great to zoom in on the detail, you have to zoom out and say, okay, what is the big picture? What's the overall picture? And not get too caught up in the details, because that's where you can sometimes target the wrong area in getting someone really healthy.
You're looking at many markers together rather than any individual marker when trying to come to a conclusion. Yeah, I get that. Yeah. Which is, I guess, what my point was, that, yeah, you don't want to look at one marker per se, because these are markers that can mean anything, right? You want to look at a bigger picture. So let's go to the bacterial markers. Do you find that those are usually accurate?
They can be, but I'll also say I see a lot of people, because you'll do a stool test and you'll do an organic acid test, and you'll often see the bacterial markers completely normal. And then on the stool test, it's a bit of chaos. So it doesn't necessarily translate perfectly. I find the Clostridia markers, often there's no Clostridia on the stool test, but we get the Clostridia markers that shows up. And in a sense, in that case, I'd probably trust the organic acid test markers more, because we have to remember on the organic acid test, we're not measuring for the actual organism. We're measuring the metabolites that they produce, which means that wherever those organisms are, they're producing these metabolites that's being excreted in the urine, right? If these metabolites wouldn't be produced if the organisms weren't there, because some of these are very specific, especially the Clostridia markers like the HPHPA and the 4-cresol, they're very specific. And so if you see those markers, then there's definitely something going on there that could then disrupt dopamine metabolism and all of those things.
I have a question about HPHPA. So it says C. sporogenins. One of the things there, C. sporogenins is one of the bacteria that I read helps increase food tolerance and can actually be positive in some ways.
Yeah,
right?
you're
So
right. I think there's
I
something
guess it
like
would be a
200 different species of Clostridia, and overall, Clostridia species they do promote food tolerance, right? So Clostridia has a huge role to play in protecting against food sensitivities. Yeah, so I agree with you. And so it's not that these are, with the exception of the C. difficile, of course, it's not that
right.
these are bad, it's the overgrowth. So it's the balance, right? So you just don't want them to overgrow and produce too much of these metabolites. So for instance, with the HPHPA, that can disrupt the dopamine beta hydroxylase enzyme. And then that affects dopamine conversion to norepinephrine, which can then have consequences for mood, learning, cognitive function, and all of those kinds of things. So it's about the balance. Even with
It'll
histamine,
affect that in the brain itself or in the gut?
no, it can affect it. It can affect it in the brain itself as well. I see this a lot, especially in children with autism. It's not that uncommon to see HPHPA or 4-cresol, which can then create a lot of those neurological issues. But I'm very careful as to label things bad or good. Now, even with histamine, with the whole mast cell activation syndrome that a lot of people are reading about and being diagnosed with, there's this tendency to think, oh, histamine is bad. And it's no, everything actually has a purpose. It's just whether it's balanced or not. And even when I see markers on a test, I don't say, oh, this is a bad marker or it's a good marker. It's no, the markers on the test just tell us there's something going on and the body's behaving in a different way. And the body's not behaving in the wrong way. It's behaving in the right way, because this is what I explain to people is if something's happening in the biochemistry, your body will then shift in order to stop the cells from dying. It doesn't care that your hormones tank. It doesn't care that you're feeling depressed. It doesn't care that you can't sleep. It doesn't care that you're fatigued. All it cares about is that I don't die. I don't want to die, so I'm going to shift things in a certain direction. And so when we look at markers, it's not so much about fixing the marker. It's okay, this is what the body's doing. Why is the body doing it? And then fixing that, which goes back to the root cause stuff, right, that we've been talking about. So
Right.
that's like how I try to tell people is we're not here fixing markers. We're trying to see what is the body doing and why, and then trying to understand why is it doing what it's doing. And then like working backwards and fixing that, so to speak.
Is there any markers? What are the markers here that you think should be altered? Like when we're talking about conventional lab tests, there's a concept of lowest all-cause mortality, right? And then the question is it causal or just an association? One way or another, though, you want it to be in a certain range, right? And because that's the range that there's the lowest all-cause mortality, the lowest risk of people dying when it's in that range. And my philosophy is you want to get things in that range no matter what. I guess the question here is, and I got stuck with this question with somebody else that was going through this, is you don't want to change these markers per se. They're just, you want to use them in a differential diagnosis way, which I think is a little different than how I would view the conventional markers, right? You can use conventional markers also in a differential diagnosis way, but you can also view each as its own goal of let's get this in the optimal range. And if we do, it's probably going to fix other things that we don't know exactly how it's connected to.
So I've got a couple of those inorganic acid tests that I would really focus on. And I would say I would prioritize them for different reasons on why I would want them in the optimal range. So the Candida markers are not very high, depending on where they are. Typically, they're not very high on my priority unless they were very elevated. The Clostridia markers are because of their ability to disrupt dopamine regulation, which then has consequences for a whole bunch of other things. So that definitely. I'd probably say the
So
oxalate
what are the, so one second, what are the, let's think of a single treatment, if you will. Not that you're necessarily going to do it just if you have these markers, same with the labs, but what would be a treatment, potential treatments to get these in range? You're like, okay, these are out of range. If without thinking about it in a differential diagnosis kind of way, trying to figure out root causes, what is like certain things? Okay, this is out of range. Here's a few examples of what would get this in the optimal range.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the Clostridia markers, that would be, I would typically use antibacterial herbs and things there that I know that works. The benefit of testing and doing a lot of retesting is you do start figuring out what works and what doesn't. because not everything out there are as effective as they may be claimed to be. So certainly with the Clostridia markers, I'd be using antimicrobial herbs, not just to press the growth of them, so to speak.
We're talking about oregano oil,
So
mainly,
that,
maybe.
I like using biocidin, which is, you'd probably be familiar with that. I think there's also certain probiotics that is quite effective for Clostridia, I believe. I think Lactobacilli ruder is a probiotic that can also suppress Clostridia overgrowth as well. So there's many different ways that you can do it, and different people will find that different things work for them.
You'll see those things normalize if you give these antimicrobials or if you give them L-reuteri.
Yeah,
You will see on the retest that, hey, okay, these markers are changing. Okay,
absolutely.
that's
So I
great.
do see that. Yeah. And then that's how I've sort of learned what do I use for Candida? What do I use for Clostridia? Because there's not like
Okay.
this one magic formula that just works for all the different types of gut organisms, right? They're all a bit unique in what they react to and what they don't.
So if you see 4-cresol elevated, you can say, okay, let's do L-reuteri and some antimicrobial herbs.
Yeah, what I can say is I have had clients with the 4 cresol elevated. I've given them what I've given them. Next time we test, it's either completely normalized or significantly decreased.
Okay.
And so I've also seen people with, because the typical conventional treatment there would be antibiotics. And I think what's the
Rifaximin?
vancomycin? I think vancomycin is the typical treatment for Clostridia difficile. So I've seen people who've been on the antibiotics and it didn't decrease it. So I find it's very hit and miss. The same thing for H. pylori. Some people respond to triple antibiotic therapy and some people don't. And some people respond to herbal therapy
Okay.
and some people don't, right? I don't think there's a guarantee with anything. And for whatever reason, some people will respond to certain things, but not other things. I have found things that 90% of the time does work for a lot of these markers.
And you think 3-cresol is the best marker for that out of these
Yeah,
Clostridium markers?
yeah. So 4 cresol is very specific for Clostridia difficile, which is a pathogenic Clostridia. There's no other Clostridia bacteria, as far as I'm aware, that produces 4 cresol. So it's very specific Clostridia. Whereas with HPHPA, as you can see there's a lot of different Clostridia species that can produce that. And it's just that you
Right.
just don't want it to be overgrown. That's all. It's all about balance.
Okay. Okay. I recognize 3-indolacetic acid. If I had to guess, I think there's benefits to that actually, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, look, that could be. It's a very common organic acid that pops up on a lot of different labs, and they like just use it as a very general gut dysbiosis marker. It's not actually very specific, from my understanding. And I believe
Hmm.
I think it's a metabolite from tryptophan metabolism. Because there's a lot of gut
Yeah,
bacteria that
exactly.
metabolize amino acids, right?
That's one of the benefits of the tryptophan. I don't remember if it's exactly the indolacetic acid, but it converts into various indoles that are beneficial.
Yeah, there's one of them called and I can't remember what IPA stands for. It could be indole propionic acid, but don't quote me on that. But that, for
Yeah,
instance,
yeah,
is a
that
very
it
high
is.
beneficial
Yeah,
metabolite produced by gut bacteria from tryptophan, and it has like brain protective or neurological protective properties, right? So you're absolutely right. Like some of these metabolites can be very beneficial.
exactly. So, which is actually what the C. sporogennes, some of those species creates. It creates that IPA, and so that's one of the. But again, the question is which species. That's where it gets complex. Exactly, they're not. There's specific bacteria, whereas this is a little more generic. That's why I want to try to. That's why I'm asking, like specifically. You're looking at all of them, but I guess 4-cresol would be the most specific for the bad one.
Yeah, full cresol is this. There's nothing positive about full cresol, so
Exactly.
that would
Yeah.
definitely be something that you'd want to get rid of.
So let's go down a little bit. So we went through, and I guess if you're looking at the bacterial markers as well, you would also be giving antimicrobial herbs and stuff if those are elevated.
Yeah, if it was very elevated. So if it was just slightly elevated and they didn't really have like major gut issues, I probably wouldn't do much there. But if they did have severe gut issues, then sure, I'd be looking at that triggered. And unfortunately, with your organic acid test, it doesn't tell you exactly which species is dysbiotic. So you'd have to do a STIBO test if you want to find out if STIBO, or you'd have to do like a stool test if you want to tease out the different organisms a little bit more and be a little bit more
Right.
specific with the treatment. But yeah, if they had symptoms and those markers were elevated, I would certainly treat that as well.
Okay. So moving down to the list, we got these oxalate metabolites. How relevant are those?
For me, they are quite relevant. Sometimes they're just marginally elevated, which then I don't really pay too much attention. But if they're quite elevated, and in this case, they're almost double, at least the oxalic acid, I certainly take notice. And the reason why I take notice is not so much because of the oxalates themselves, it's more about what they do. And so we know that oxalates are very strong binders. They are very strong binders to cations, which would be minerals like zinc and magnesium. And they can also bind to heavy metals like cadmium and mercury and lead and things like that. And if they bind to heavy metals, they can keep the heavy metals stuck in the cells or the tissues, and it becomes harder to detoxify them. And if they bind to minerals, then the minerals become unavailable. And so now you get like symptoms of mineral deficiencies, which is vast, thyroid, adrenal. It's pretty much, it's a huge amount of symptoms.
Yeah, one thing I'm curious about is the urinary oxalates. Is it possible that if you're urinating more oxalates, then there's going to be less oxalates in the cells?
That is a possibility. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a possibility. And that's, again, a very good point. We have to remember that whenever we test urine and hair, those are the two things I can just think of from the top of my head. We have to remember that's excretion. We're measuring excretion, right? Same with the mold biotoxin urinary markers. It's the body getting rid of stuff. And in that vein, I would probably say some of the sickest people that I see have the most normal markers that you can think of, right? Because their
Mhm.
body's not getting rid of stuff. And often when you start treatment with them and you test again, second time they're feeling better, the test results look worse than what it did first time. And you think, oh my gosh, what's going on here? But it's because their body's now actually actively eliminating. So, and then that's why I always say to practitioners, don't read tests as literally as they are. You have to think, what is it that I'm measuring? And you're absolutely right. In urine, is the person excreting, is the person not? And I actually can think of some tests where people had oxalate issues, their oxalate markers were normal. And on the second test, it was abnormal. It was elevated because now their body's actually dumping it, right? You're absolutely right. That certainly is, you should take that into account as well.
So that's not a marker, though, that you're going to be treating the other one we discussed, or will you be treating it?
I'd certainly consider it because I'd be thinking, again, if they've got gut issues, because there's a strong association between oxalates and bile issues or insufficient gallbladder function. Not so much gallbladder disease, but I guess a gallbladder that's just not functioning at optimal levels. So if they have, let's say, symptoms of SIBO, which can be linked to gallbladder issues, if I suspect that they may have poor production of SAM, and there's maybe some methylation issues, which can then also affect gallbladder function, then I would look at this in terms of gallbladder function. And I may not actually treat the oxalate, but I may work on optimizing gallbladder function or healthy bile or what have you. So,
Okay.
yeah,
So high oxalates is a sign of maybe some issues with gallbladder,
it can be.
gallbladder.
It can be.
And are you going to give something like TUDCA for that?
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I'll do something like Tutska. Sometimes I will, I guess, do gallbladder herbs like a globe artichoke and things like that as well. Sometimes I'll use ox bile instead. For instance, if they've had their gallbladder removed, I would probably just do
Mm.
something like ox bile. So I guess it depends on whether I think is bile insufficiency due to not enough phosphatidylcholine, not enough bile salts, which is the taurocin glycine and all of that. But also sometimes it can be thyroid function, right? The thyroid, and especially T4, plays a huge role in bile release from the otios of sphincter into this small intestine. So sometimes it could be low thyroid function can also play a role. You start so like just thinking a little bit broadly, like what could be that person's issue of not optimal bile function.
Okay. And what are you looking for in terms of thyroid function, T4, T3, free T3? You're looking at all those markers, free T4 as well.
Yeah,
What kind of numbers are you looking for there?
yeah, with TSH, if the measurements are the same across the ocean, I look for TSH between 1 to 2. I know that the range is pretty high, I think up to 6 or something like that, but I like between 1 and 2 for me is an optimal range. Of course, if they're on thyroid medication, it's going to be less, and that would be normal, 0 point whatever. That's what it should be if someone's on thyroid medication. T4 and T3, I look for them to be like smack bang in the middle, which in Australia is, I think, around about 16 for T4, and I think maybe 3 or 4 for T3 on the top of my head. But then I also like to check for TPO antibodies as well. I find a lot of people have the TPO antibody, which can then certainly affect thyroid function. But I also look at thyroid because the thyroid is very responsive to the environment. You'd probably know that you could test thyroid markers 6 or 8 weeks later and maybe get a different reading because very affected by stress and what could be going on in that first exercise and all of that kind of stuff. So even in terms of thyroid, I still look at it as, and for the most part, as secondary, meaning that it's very rare, in my opinion, that the thyroid is the primary issue. In my opinion, it's a lot more a secondary issue of something else, whether it be stress or whatever else is going on for the person.
Yeah, every one of my thyroid markers goes all over the map every time I test it. Meaning, yeah, it changes every time. They're not stable. They change for reasons. I'm doing different things, but yeah, they are all over the map there. Whether it's TSH, T4, T3, and free T3, they're changing like quite significantly. You check for free T3 as well?
Yeah, I check for free T3 as well. Don't check for the reverse T3 that often, and not necessarily because I don't want to. It's just really hard to get, I don't know, tests sometimes done here in Australia. I don't know if it's the same there in the US. But what frustrates me a little bit is often medical practitioners will only check the TSH level, right? They won't even bother doing the T3 and the T4. And TSH is, strictly speaking, not even a thyroid hormone, right? It's a brain hormone. It's what the brain releases to tell the thyroid to make more thyroid hormone. So it's sometimes frustrating that's the only one that they'll sometimes test for because you can have a normal TSH, abnormal T3, abnormal T4, and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah.
What do you do if let's say somebody has a low T3, right? Or lower on the lower end? Is that something that concerns you at all?
It depends. So let's say they've got, let's say TSH, if TSH is normal and T4 is normal, but T3 is low, then I'd be thinking,
Yeah.
okay, either is the T3 turning into reverse T3, right? And then that would be like where I may look at selenium deficiencies or things like that. But on the other hand, let's say there were no deficiencies because you also need vitamin D, zinc, and iron, and a whole bunch of other nutrients, and vitamin A for healthy thyroid function. Let's say it wasn't a deficiency issue. Then I would probably also look at it like, okay, going back to is the body behaving appropriately? Because thyroid, especially T3, active T3, would stimulate mitochondrial function, right? It would stimulate metabolism and energy production and all of that. And if someone, let's say, has for whatever reason, a high level of free radicals in the body, like maybe because of overactive immune function, because that's what the immune system does in response to infection, it produces free radicals, then the mitochondria will slow down so that it doesn't produce more free radicals as part of energy production, because the body may say, hang on, I can't handle any more free radicals because they don't have enough antioxidant and these free radicals are damaging the cells, so I'll slow down mitochondrial function. And part of that could be also less T3, right? The body will slow down all of those processes in a way to not produce more free radicals and to protect itself. So sometimes there will be a reason. And so especially when it comes to the thyroid and mitochondrial function, we're sometimes quick to throw in a thyroid supplement or a mitochondrial supplement. And I guess what I'm saying is sometimes we have to sit back and just think, is that the right thing to do? Or is the body purposefully slowing down all of these things because there's something happening that we maybe not seeing? So, yeah.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. Let's go back to the organic acids. Are you looking at any of the other oxalate metabolites?
Sometimes I do. For me, I very rarely see all three of them elevated. If all three of them were elevated, I think B6 deficiency. In this case, for instance, number 19, glyceric acid is normal, but number 20, glycolic acid is not. And so glycolic acid, if I remember correctly from my biochemistry, glycolic acid actually converts into oxalic acid somewhere along the line. And it needs, there's two things that it needs to convert to oxalic acid. One of them is vitamin B1 or thiamine, and the other one I think is glutathione. So sometimes in this specific case, I would look at this and say, okay, this person may need either vitamin B1 and or glutathione. And then what will happen is glycolic acid will tend to decrease, but oxalic acid will tend to increase because you're just converting one to the other. And so in this case, my expectation here would be that, okay, if I give this person vitamin B1 and or glutathione, that glycolic would go lower and oxalic would probably go up to, I don't know, 150, 160 or what have you. So in this case, I would look at number 21 oxalic acid as actually being higher than what it really is, if that makes
Mhm.
sense, because
Got it.
there's a conversion problem there. So you just have to realign your expectations or what it is that you're looking at.
Okay, so let's move to the glycolytic metabolites, lactic and pyruvic acid. What are you looking for there?
So what I'm looking for here is common patterns that I often see is very high lactic acid, very low pyruvate. And that would be an indication that this person may be in a glycolysis state, which is normal for a cell danger response. That's normal if you've just had an injury or something's going on. But you don't want that to continue on for too long because glycolysis is a very inefficient way of producing energy. It relies on glucose, and I believe for every glucose molecule, you produce 2 ATP molecules in the glycolytic cycle. Whereas in the TCA cycle, and especially if you break down fat, which is not part of glycolytic metabolism, for every fat molecule you break down, you produce something like 36 ATP molecules, right? So that's the energy production you want to prefer because that's a lot more efficient. And you get a lot more energy from that. So I'm looking for high lactic acid, low pyruvate, which is not a good pattern. Sometimes you'll also see higher pyruvate and very low citric acid, number 29. Because pyruvate, that's like when it gets into the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle, becomes citric acid. Pyruvate essentially breaks down to acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA combines with oxaloacetate, and then it becomes citric acid. So if you end up with a high pyruvate and a low citric acid, to me, that would indicate that there may be a block in the pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme. So there's a block in the enzyme that gets the pyruvate into the TCA cycle. And then there's various reasons for blocks there, but a very common reason would be heavy metals. So heavy metal issues is a very common reason for that inhibition. Could be other reasons too, but those are probably the two most common patterns in terms of glycolysis that I would be looking for.
And what would you do? What would you do for high lactic acid and let's say the high lactic acid?
If I saw high lactic acid, I might give them creatine if, again, there's symptoms linked back to it. Let's say they had body aches and pains, brain fog, and things like that. I might give them creatine as a temporary reason, but I would be looking at correcting this the whole energy cycle here would be what I would be looking at. So I'd probably expect if there was high lactic acid, there'd be a few other of these markers, the Krebs cycle markers, that would also be out of range. And so the whole point here would be to try and optimize all of them. But sometimes you can see this is why patterns are so cool, is if I see a couple of patterns, a couple of things that maybe make me think that it could be methylation things, then I'd be working more on that, right? Because we know that with creatine, we know that creatine is what our body makes to get rid of lactic acid. And we know that we need methylation to make creatine, right? We use a ton of SAM to make creatine. But let's say then I also see, for instance, I see that this one doesn't have it. It's an old test, but on the newer test, they also measure DOPAC in the dopamine metabolites. So if let's say DOPAC was higher than HVA, then that would tell me that the COMT enzyme was also not functioning optimally. And we know that COMT also needs SAM as a cofactor. And then I may go down to the nutrients, and I may see in uracil and thiamine, uracil may be really high, thiamine may be low, which would indicate folate issues. We know we need folate for SAM production. I may see a vitamin B12 high, which in this case, you would read it the opposite way around. A lot of the markers here with the asterisk, you read them, if they're high, they're actually a deficiency. So I may see B12 deficiency. And I'd be like, okay, there's all of these indications that may be pointing to poor or optimal SAM production. And so maybe when I see the high lactic acid here, I may think more, okay, I'm not just going to give them creatine, and I'm not just going to look at the energy cycle metabolites. I may actually look at more methylation as an area to focus on, because there's all of these different signs and patterns that I'm seeing that's pointing towards that. So again, not everyone's going to get the same treatment. And so it may depend on some of the other markers and what I do there.
Wouldn't it be simpler just to look at homocysteine to see if they're good in methylation or not? I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of markers you're looking at here. If this is elevated, why not just look at homocysteine? It seems like it would
Well,
be
you
more
can look at
reliable.
homocysteine, but I'll also say that it may not give you the whole picture. But in general, if homocysteine is high, you could expect that there's a CBS inhibition and thus increased SORB production and inhibition of methyltransferase enzymes. If homocysteine is low, you could say, okay, CBS is upregulated and SAM is essentially going down what I call a CBS toilet, going towards glutathione production. But I also think you can have normal homocysteine and still have issues. Because a lot of times markers can be normal, but they're masking what's really going on. I don't know if I'm explaining myself correctly, very clearly, but you could have a normal homocysteine, but maybe for that person, the homocysteine shouldn't be normal for what's going on in their body, right? Let's say, for instance, that they have, I'm going to use an example. Let's say they've got mold, right? And mold can inhibit some of the genes or enzymes in the glutathione cycle. I think one of them is the GCLC enzyme. So mold can inhibit that one, which means homocysteine is not converting to glutathione. But you're measuring homocysteine now. Homocysteine looks normal, right? And you think, oh, there's nothing wrong here. But it could be that homocysteine is not moving down. So in fact, the homocysteine is higher than it should be. And if it's higher than it should be, it may tell us that there is still a SAM deficiency, because SAM becomes homocysteine once it donates a methyl group, it becomes homocysteine, right? So that's why I'm very careful to sometimes just look at one marker, and one marker could have multiple possibilities, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I would like a little more clarification there. So if somebody, give me an example where, first of all, what do you consider the optimal homocysteine?
For me, optimal is between 7 to 9. That I
Okay.
realize for some other people it may be different, but for me it's 7 to 9.
I would agree with that. Yeah. So let's say somebody has between 7 and 9. Give me examples, like specific numbers where you're like, because I wasn't really following with the more general conceptual framework. Give me an
Okay.
example. Somebody has a 9 and you still think they're poor methylation. So give me like specific examples there.
No, so generally, if I just look at homocysteine, it's between 7 to 9. That's not my first thought. Is like, oh no, this looks okay. It's more so if they have other indicators. Let's say for the indicators that I've just mentioned here, the lactic acid, the B12 deficiency, folate deficiency. Then I might think, oh, is this homocysteine telling me the whole story? And then I might look at it a little bit differently. But I know if I just had the homocysteine and I didn't have any other indicators that would possibly be an issue, I probably wouldn't jump to that conclusion unless I had symptoms, I guess, that would really point to that. When homocysteine goes lower, like let's say around 5, for me, that's oxidative stress. It means that CBS enzyme is upregulated. The body's prioritizing making glutathione than to SAM or SAM's functions. If it's like around 13, then I know that there's very likely an inhibition in that CBS enzyme, and thus very likely an inhibition on the other methyltransferase enzymes. But if it's between 7 to 9, that's generally my first thought is, okay, it doesn't look like there's anything to see here. But I will take signs and symptoms very strongly into consideration, and also any other markers that might point to some issues there.
Okay, so you still might look at somebody who's a 9 and say this person could still have methylation problems. And what's happening is maybe they have lower homocysteine because they have also lower SAM and just not as much. Yeah, if you have
Yeah.
lower SAM, then also less of it is going to convert to homocysteine. I feel
Absolutely.
like I might come to that conclusion if somebody has like a very low protein diet. They don't have enough methionine. But I feel like if you have enough methionine, I've I haven't seen somebody with like low homocysteine who was well nourished from a diet perspective, right? It's usually either high or it could be optimal. I don't know. Maybe you have, right? You've seen more clients than me now, but what I'm saying is that I understand conceptually what you're saying. You're saying if they have they could just have lower SAM and therefore low homocysteine, right?
Yeah. So they could
But I
have,
feel
for
like that
instance,
would be, yeah.
yeah, they could, for instance, have low SAM and let's say also a CBS inhibition because of, let's say, a B6 deficiency or what have you. And they could have normal homocysteine, right? Because in a way, the CBS inhibition is saving the homocysteine, so to speak. So I've certainly seen that on methylation panels in some people where I have
This
seen that.
B6 generally takes homocysteine down.
Yes.
If they
Yeah. So
had a B6 deficiency, then their homocysteine would probably be elevated.
yeah, but I guess that's what I was trying to say, right? So let's say you have someone with low SAMe, right? So not a lot of SAMe would be converting to homocysteine, but you also had a, let's say, B6 deficiency and a CBS inhibition, which means not a lot of that homocysteine would go down into cysteine and glutathione
Mhm.
production. So that could then make your homocysteine look normal, but
Got
the
it. I
homocysteine may
see
look
what you're saying.
normal, but the SAMe may not be normal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It comes back to that point where if you have lower SAMe, which then, you're using less methylation, you'll have lower homocysteine. I'm genetically, I have a predisposition for lower methylation. I don't know. We have a report on methylation and self-decode, whether you have a predisposition for lower methylation. It's looking at many different kinds of variants. And I know I do regardless, but the genetic predisposition kind of reinforced my assumption. And my homocysteine tends to be elevated unless I take a lot of actions to bring it down. Creatine was one of the things I thought about. I saw people mention, hey, look, your body uses a lot of creatine, methylation to produce creatine. But then I looked at the clinical trials and I was surprised that it actually does not lower homocysteine clinically. So it seems like something is, I don't know, it's something I don't understand about that produces
Was
that
it
result.
maybe it's because the person is using that creatine? So for instance, they might not have had enough creatine to use, and now that they are taking creatine, there's a lot more creatine to use in terms of energy production and all the stuff that creatine does. And so maybe it's
So you're
the
assuming that they're using the they're creating the same amount of creatine, but they're using more of it when you supplement or storing it or whatever it is, right? So
well,
it's
yeah, I
the
guess that could
production rate is not changing.
yeah, that would be, I guess, a hypothesis. But I guess it depends on
It's
the
not a bad
study and how many
hypothesis.
subjects were in it and how big was the study. Because that wouldn't happen in everyone, right? May happen in some.
Right. No, that's a good hypothesis. It could be that they weren't done for long enough. And, you take creatine, it doesn't shut off your creatine production pathways unless maybe you take it for a really long time and then you reach saturation. I'd have to look at the details there more, but that's actually an interesting point. Yeah. And I think there may have been some that did show a decrease. I know there was like two of them that didn't show any decrease. Yeah. It could be like the details matter there. Let's look at, okay, so do you look at the mitochondrial markers here? Are those relevant? You mentioned citric acid is something you look at
Yeah,
as it relates to pyruvic acid, but on its own, are you looking at these mitochondrial markers?
I do. For me, they're very important. And I really look more specifically at patterns here, right? So there are always very interesting patterns here. First of all, certainly when someone has Candida overgrowth, and it's not going to be in everyone, but a lot of times because a lot of organisms hijack our own energy metabolism pathways, right, to favor
Yeah.
themselves. And there's various reasons for it. They hijack a lot of stuff. They hijack our own folate to make DNA for them. They hijack our cholesterol synthesis pathways for their cell membranes and all of that. But here, for instance, what we commonly see with Candida is that we'll have citric acid elevated, malic acid elevated, and cynic acid elevated. And one of the reasons is because Candida organisms have a cycle called the glyoxylate cycle, which is a little bit different to the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle, but in a way they sort of superimpose their energy cycle onto ours and so use our biochemistry. So that would be one that I'd look for. The 2-oxoglutaric acid, I think you talked about alpha ketoglutarate a little bit earlier and how you've experimented with it, because essentially that's what 2-oxoglutaric acid is. It's alpha ketoglutarate. And we know that glutamate can enter the TCA cycle here, or 2-oxoglutaric acid can leave the TCA cycle here, right? Depending on how the body is shifting with glutamine and glutamate and all of those kinds of things. But one of the other aspects, and now I'm getting a little bit technical, I know into redox molecules. I love the redox science and all of that. But the 2-oxoglutaric acid is like leaving and entering between the glutamate into the TCA cycle. There's a lot of production of NADPH, which is a redox molecule. And NADPH is essential in producing glutathione and in producing cholesterol. So sometimes these shifts could also happen because the body's trying to make more NADPH for either detoxification or cholesterol synthesis, right? So sometimes that can be the case. Succinic acid is like because with the TCA cycle, I sometimes describe it as a hamster wheel, right? It's like a hamster wheel. It's like glucose enters this hamster wheel. With every turn of the hamster wheel, all of these electrons are being produced, right? NADH and all of these electrons are being produced. And then these electrons leave at number 24. At succinic acid is like where the electrons leave. And then that's where they enter I call it the battery system, the electron transport chain, which is this battery system in the mitochondria. And that's like where it jumps from one cell to the other cell until you have ATP or energy, right? And in the cells. So if succinic acid is high, it would tell me that there's a block there, that the electrons are not able to leave and enter that battery system there. And depending on how high succinic acid is, it can tell us like what could be going on there. If it's not massively elevated, again, we think thyroid function because we need thyroxine to function there in complex 2 of the electron transport chain. We may think of nutritional deficiencies because we need riboflavin or vitamin B2 and CoQ10 to function there as well. But if it's elevated quite a bit, if it's very high, then we start thinking of heavy metals, environmental toxins, and other things that could be inhibiting that complex 2. So for me, I see succinic acid elevated a lot, actually, maybe in 70% of tests that I see. Most often it's not very high and it's just marginally elevated. And then maybe in 5 to 10% of cases, I'll see it very, very elevated, where it's very problematic.
Let's take a slight shift in how we look at this thing. I'm curious in terms of optimization. I don't really have any specific problems right now, right?
Mhm.
But I just want to optimize, become more resilient. And I find that I'm testing 300 different conventional biomarkers, right? And I find that getting those in the optimal range produces results. It just does. Like whenever I get something in the optimal range, there's some benefit that I notice otherwise. And my question is, I'm going to start taking a lot of these tests just because I want to be more informed about them and develop my own opinions and see, okay, if this is elevated, I'm going to try this, see if it actually works, like test the hypothesis. The question is, if I come to you, I give you my result, I don't have any problems. Is it something that you could use to optimize your function, you feel?
Absolutely. And I actually get a lot of people who do not have health conditions, but let's say they're athletes and they're just interested in like optimal health and how's my body working. And so what I would be looking here, if what your goal was, I'd be looking at these markers and I'd also be looking at the fatty acid markers here, right? The fatty acid oxidation markers. Because what I would be looking at, what I would look at with those is like how, and I'm not going to say it's 100% correct, but it's as good as we can go. It's like how well fat adapted are you? If you have a lot of fatty acid oxidation markers, it means that your body doesn't know what to do with fat. It may be breaking it down, but it's not using it efficiently as an energy source, right? If you had, let's say, if your fatty acid markers are all normal, but you had the high lactic acid, to me, that would say, okay, it looks like your body's stuck in sugar metabolism, which is not what you want. You don't want your body stuck in carbon sugar metabolism. You want your body to be able to use fats and other fuel sources if it needs to.
If you have a
Mhm.
lot of fatty acid oxidation markers, I don't see why that would indicate that you are not burning fat as well because you
No,
are
so you are
oxidizing
burning
them.
fat,
So,
but you're not using it effectively as a fuel source, right? So for instance, if we go back here, and again, you've got to take things in terms of in context. If you had, let's say, high adipic suburic and sebacic acid, then that would say to me you may not have enough carnitine to take those fatty acids that you've now broken down, get it into the cell, and to burn it for fuel, right? So you're wasting it. Doesn't mean you're not breaking down fat, but you're wasting it, right? If you had high 3-hydroxybutyric and acetoacetic acid, these are your ketone markers, right? So even though
mhm.
so acetoacetic acid is burnt ketones and the 3-hydroxybutyric acid is stored ketones, even though I don't really believe that is this something like stored ketones, but just for ease of explanation. And so if they were high, if they were both high and you were doing like keto diets and stuff like that, then that would be like, okay, that's the reason for it being high. But if it was high, you were not doing keto diet, then I'd be thinking, okay, there's some kind of ketoacidosis going on. And that would maybe not be a good thing. It may be that there's some insulin issues or blood sugar issues going on, right? And then you'd want to take like blood glucose and measure that with these markers. If let's say we measure, again, we measure these guys, and let's say all your mitochondrial markers were really low, right? They were all on the low side, but you were, let's say, doing intermittent fasting. Then I'd be like, that makes sense, right? Because with intermittent fasting, there'll be less fuel going in, so you would expect them to be low. But let's say they were low and you ate like a standard American diet, then I'd be thinking, oh, maybe you are insulin resistant because there's not enough. Maybe it's the GLUT4 receptors and glucose is not getting into the cells. So a lot of these markers, I really take into context the person's diet, history, background, because you have to interpret it with what's going on in their life. Sometimes these markers can be a good thing, and sometimes they cannot be a good thing, depending on what that person is doing.
Okay, that's interesting. So, are you doing these organic acid? I don't know what your health goals are now, or if you have any issues or whatever, but are you doing these organic acids tests yourself for optimization, testing them every so often, and then optimizing them based on your results and seeing how they change?
No, I should be doing it. I've done it once. So I've done the hormones and organic acid test once. And first of all, I'll just say I don't have any health issues. I don't think I have any health issues. So hopefully I don't. But yeah, I was actually shocked at I had a lot of stuff wrong. I was like, this isn't good. And obviously there's things I have to work on. But I guess it's also another really good example of what you alluded to earlier, that sometimes you can have these markers, but you may not have symptoms. And do you need to treat everything more in terms of people who are sick and all of that kind of thing? But look, if I am a bit like you, I love experimenting. I don't know why I've never done it, but I would that's something that I would have loved to do is test, do stuff, retest, do stuff, retest, and see what changes. Like one of the things I wanted to do a long time ago, because again, I think we underestimate the effect of stress on our biochemistry, is I would have loved to do a test and then let's say maybe do not even take supplement, but maybe let's do something like, I don't know, meditation or some kind of whatever, more like focusing on the stress aspect and then retest and see how did that change? Does it change the markers? And if so, how does it change the marker? Because not everything's about popping a pill, right? So I would have loved to do that, do things where I change my diet or just do stress techniques or change the type of exercise I do or what have you. I think that would be such a cool experiment to do if one has the time and money and stuff to do it for sure.
That's my goal is to I want to take these tests. That's the gold standard that I have for these things, right? When somebody's sick, it's there's a lot of things that are going wrong and I don't know anybody's body as well as I know mine. 67% of listeners aren't subscribed to the show, so please don't forget to show your support by hitting the subscribe button now. You'll not only be supporting the show, but also investing in yourself and your health journey, all while helping to keep us ad-free.